technical little deal here, but welcome to everybody. We got a large portion of the crew has joined for our single vineyard tasting. Jean-Nicolas, you can see, but he is struggling with getting out of full screen on the preview that we did for all the slides that we have for you today. So just a little bit of technical difficulties, but welcome. I hope your Saturday is going well. I suppose this is a little bit like
yes. You can see probably my slide. You can see my...
Yes, we can see the slide.
Can you see my slide?
Yes. It looks beautiful.
You cannot see me, but you can see the slide. That's already something.
That's true. And
that's
you do
already
have
something.
Your son is no longer your son is no longer streaming.
Yes.
You're a little garbled.
He's not pleased about that. Yeah. Yes. Well, no, he's out. He's out, and
okay.
Not too happy.
You eliminated the problem.
But, that's done. Yeah. All right.
Okay. Well, I guess we should get started. Are we going to get started with just have screens and not have?
I'm sorry about that, but for the moment, I cannot help it.
All right. Well, why don't you start? Let's do it. Everyone needs to start drinking. This is what they're here for.
Absolutely. So, Jay, you want to start with the Bishop Creek?
Well, I think first of all, just welcome everybody. I'm sorry we're having these technical difficulties where we have the slides up and we can't seem to get them down to be able to have you see Jean-Nicolas and I. I mean, perhaps you can see Jean-Nicolas and I'm not really sure. But at any rate, welcome to our single vineyard launch for 2017 and the launch of these 3 single vineyards. This being now the 14, 15, 16, the 4th vintage of single vineyards that we have presented to the world. And I think most of you know that these 3 vineyards represent the same wines that go into our Willamette Valley, but they're just blended. The Bishop Creek is every year the largest element of our Willamette Valley blend, usually about a third. And then the Momtazi is probably the next. Momtazi and Nisa are in the sort of 7% to 10% area, depending on the year and depending on what tastes best. But so between these 3 wines, you certainly have more than 50% of the Willamette Valley that they make up. But we do a small bottling of single vineyards, as you know, and as you have in front of you, or many of you that either had the wines already, or many of you ordered the 3-pack in advance of this tasting, pardon me, to be able to taste along with us. And it's quite interesting. I mean, maybe Jean-Nicolas, you can start out by tasting, well, why do we, or speaking to why we do the single vineyards. I mean, why do we only make the Willamette Valley, and why we do these 3 single vineyards. And then we can sort of go through each of the bottles one by one and talk about the 17 vintage and what makes this vintage interesting, which it is certainly different than most of the other vintages that we've had since 2014. But maybe we talk about why we do these single vineyards and why these vineyards.
Sure. Yes, it's an interesting history, and it's an interesting process because, of course, you know that in Burgundy we do only single vineyards. We rave about our terroirs and our climat, as we say, and so the approach in Oregon was a bit different. With when you set up a new winery, when you set up a brand, you want to have some kind of consistency, and it was in these preliminary stages a a phase where we wanted to really observe and see what was happening and what we got and what kind of material and what kind of wine we were working with. So the initial goal was to really to be that we wanted to be really representative of Oregon and the Willamette Valley, and right from the first year, and do some single vineyards perhaps a bit later on, after a few years of practice. But actually, it's first of all proved, to observe, you need to keep a little bit of each wine that you've done prior to the blend. And actually, from the first year, we saw that we had some really nice sites and really interesting wines. So we thought that it would really be a shame, not only worth it, but really be a shame if we didn't play this single vineyard game right on and right from the start, because these wines were so exciting right from the start. So we started with Bishop Creek and Nisa, and in 14, and we've extended to Montazzi in 15. Basically, this is the how the process started and how we ended up, but very quickly we changed plans very quickly from our initial thinking.
Yeah, and I think there's always the possibility that we'll make a single vineyard from some of the other 8, or not the other 8, but there's 8 in total. So there's 5 other vineyards of which we have never made a single vineyard from. But each year we kind of toy with that idea, and depending on the vintage. But as I think all of you know, we vinify each of the vineyards completely separately all along. And I think Jean-Nicolas was referring to that. And so we have the option each vintage, if we wanted to do a single vineyard of Temperance Hill, or we wanted to do a single vineyard of Hopewell or Highland or one of the others, then we certainly have that option. But so far we've stuck with just these 3. We did in 2017 do something interesting, which I think many of you know about already, but is we blended 3 of the vineyards, the Highland, the Nisa, and the Bishop Creek, into own rooted, because of the uniqueness of those 3 vineyards, those being the 3 vineyards in our portfolio that are ungrafted. And so we did that blend. But I mean, Jean-Nicolas, it's entirely possible that we would do a single vineyard at Temperance Hill, and we've thought about that a couple times, but it's not off the table.
Absolutely. So it's because we've chosen actually to work all our sites with as if they were single vineyards, as if we were going to bottle them separately. But these 3 sites are special, and I wanted to really tell you this, tell you about this process, and because I was coming to Oregon, when we talked, Jay and I, and with others, with Tracy, with Jonah, when we thought we would do this and issue mainly and mostly a Willamette Valley blend, I said, well, okay, even though that was not exactly what I was doing in Burgundy, but really it was a big surprise. It was a big, pleasant surprise to see these sites and to realize how much Oregon is terroir driven. And if you see this this map, I should have known, of course, coming from Burgundy, I should have known that Pinot Noir does express terroir so well. But it's when you see this map, you see the various AVAs, and they have a certain consistency. They've been well designed, and it's interesting. It's so interesting to see that the Dundee Hills really express finesse, lushness, and certain sweetness, where Minville and Yamhill Carlton express a little bit more structure, and Yamhill Carlton some tannins. So it's really. I should have known. I know Pinot Noir in Burgundy does express terroir, and that we rave about terroirs and so on. But it's true also of Oregon, and the region has come some ways into has really been successful in designing various areas that really make sense. And so in these various AVAs, so we have, I think, 3 vineyards which are especially interesting, starting with Bishop Creek. And one of the reasons is that these vineyards are interesting also because of the age of the vines. But it helps a lot that the vines have had time to explore the soil and really go deep down into the soil and really be able to express the potential they're planted in. So it's especially true of Bishop Creek, which was planted in '88. You can see on the photo that this is a very slow. It's really it's quite hilly, and it also top and bottom, and it's unrooted, which is certainly playing a role in adding an extra layer of finesse, most probably. This is a vineyard we're seeing is really starting to express its potential. And so I don't know, because Bishop Creek is relatively isolated. You don't see many more vineyards around it. But having tasted some other vineyards, some other wines from Yamhill Carlton, they do share a certain structure there. They do share a certain tannin, and this is a vineyard which really a wine that really express some power and really some tannins, and has a big age worthiness. I think it's really a vineyard that I believe can age very well, and that will benefit from aging. So we're tasting the 17 vintage. Maybe we should talk about the vintage to set the context, and say that this is a vintage which is very nice in Oregon. It's not the most structured, powerful, concentrated vintage that we've done. It's a nice and balanced vintage. September was mixed, not too warm, so the grapes have had time to really ripen progressively, and very progressively, with some good sunny weather and some overcast weather too, and therefore we have wines which right from the start were very balanced. Relatively big crop, so again, a vintage that will foster finesse, accessibility, gentleness, very fine and very friendly wines. Not not overly serious and really smiling wines, and wines which are really engaging, I would say. In that context,
well, I was just going to say, jump in and just say that this the 17 Bishop Creek is the first vintage that we've had at Bishop Creek, where when you were drinking the wine this early in its life, you felt okay about it. I mean, in every other vintage, when you would drink a wine this close to the bottling, and this wine has now been bottled for a year, basically, you always felt like you were robbing the cradle. It was, you know, tight and closed, and it's always usually quite big. But I think in 17 is the first year where it's actually approachable. And this is, as Jean-Nicolas was referring to, is a vintage characteristic. All of our 17 wines are approachable, and approachable young. They come out, the Willamette Valley is the same in the sense that you can, you know, pop a cork now and they're wonderful drinking. I suppose that in the wine trade, they refer to these as great restaurant vintages, because as we all know,
Jay, wait. What's a restaurant? What's that?
A restaurant is a place that we used to go to and meet our friends and have drinks and eat lovely food and drink plenty of wine. And we will do so. I'm sure we will do so again. I'm sure we'll do so.
Yes. Hopefully. I don't know who's. I don't know if you've read that a number of things, but that are articles that we're reading, and somebody has predicted as a given, not even predicted, say, well, fine dining is dead. What happens to fine wine? Well, I hope that fine dining is not dead, you know. And the guy was referring to a 3-star Michelin restaurant in Denmark that was planning to transform itself into a food truck and a wine bar. And I have found that very sad, very stupid also, because I'm not going to a food truck to have good food. It's maybe I'm very old, I must say, certainly. No. Fine dining and going to a food truck to do that, and a burger, even if it's loaded with foie gras, it's not doing the trick for me. Anyway, that was.
All right, so that was. I don't have to worry about you. There you go. But back to the wine. This. I think this wine is drinking really nice now. And if any of you guys want to chat, go into the chat room and share any comments. I'd love to be able to share them with the rest of the group. But this is a wine, again, that it's approachable. It still has that depth and that complexity that Bishop Creek brings to the party. Bishop Creek, I think, every year is sort of the backbone of the Willamette Valley in many ways, in terms of the flavor profile and what it does in terms of structure. And this year is no exception. It certainly has the tannins. It certainly has the backbone. It's just a little bit softer this year, I would say. And not to say it doesn't have the acid and so forth, but it's drinking quite lovely. I mean, I guess the question, Jean-Nicolas, is you and I were talking about the 17 vintages compared to a vintage in Burgundy. And I'm not sure if it was 05, or I couldn't remember which vintage, but you were saying that it started out very accessible, but then after a year or two, it actually started to shut down and was not as accessible as it started out. And I wonder if that's what's going to happen with these 17s.
I don't think so. Of course, with wine, you cannot predict. And this allows me to speak a little bit how we work. And it's unfined, unfiltered. We try to work the wines with as less as additives as possible. You know, there's no some special powder, no tannins added. It's common practice, mind you, in today's winemaking. So we really want to be as low key and as natural as possible with these wines. And so that's the context. I think that these 17s, and hence, of course, these wines are, what I'm going to say and to convey is that these are natural wines, or it's a natural product that is evolving. And I think that 17 is very pretty, and therefore it's possible that it shuts down, because you never know. These wines being made as naturally as possible, you don't master them, and you cannot exactly predict how they will evolve. But 17 does not seem to be a vintage with the profile of a wine that will shut down again. So I was referring to what happened with the 09 Burgundies, and that was an interesting interesting occurrence, because 09 is a very dense, ripe vintage in Burgundy, but some critics said, well, it's a little bit too sweet, a little bit too ripe for it to be a great vintage, and these wines will probably evolve very well, very, very quickly, and not be really age-worthy. And what happened actually to the 09 vintage, it was very nice for a couple of years, and then it started to shut down and get tenser, which I thought was a very positive evolution for that vintage, because the wines needed to regain some tension, some structure. They were so lush and sweet, it was almost too good to be true. And during that phase, they did acquire that balance and that tension that was perhaps lacking in the vintage in the first years. And of course, this vintage has come back to being a really great and balanced and structured, together with keeping its very sweet character. So just to say that it can happen. I do not see this happening to 17. I think that we can take 14 as a model, and if I take 14 as a model, 14 was a very accessible vintage too. And I think that 14 is evolving very graciously, and possibly that in the case of Bishop Creek 14, it's without really shutting down, it's going into a phase where the wine is also getting a little tenser. In a way, you cannot say it's shut down, that wine, because the aromatics are still there.
It was wouldn't you say the 14 started out riper than the 17?
Yes, it started riper than the 17, and what I'm saying is that it's showing absolutely no sign of fading down. And right. To the contrary, I think that the wine is kind of losing that lushness that was perhaps a bit sweet at the beginning, and getting a little bit more tense, without really shutting down, but it still shows great aromatics. But it's evolving in a way. It's evolving, and it's going into a very, very progressively into a very interesting phase where I can see this wine being in 5 years very interesting still. And I think that 17 is going to take the same route. That is most probably very smooth, a very smooth evolution into age, and into becoming a wine with a lot of subtlety, but requiring some patience. Yeah. Waiting for this, I think that we're 2-3 years. We're 2 years into the bottling with this 17, so we're still young enough that the wine is really tasting very well. With the Burgundies, it's very often that after 2-3 years of bottle, it starts to really shut down and be a bit dense. Our experience so far with Oregon is that it's more progressive, but the phenomenon is also happening in some respect.
Yeah, I would say that the 14, and it's interesting how you compare the two. What's interesting about the 14 is it went from being ripe and I would say very voluptuous when it first was released. And now it's, as you say, sort of less ripe or less sweet, and it's more elegant. There's an elegance, and I think it's, as you say, it's gaining more in terms of tension. And it'll be interesting to see if that's what happens to the 17. We did bottle, not to be to correct you, but we did bottle this just a year ago. This was bottled in March, I believe, of last year. Because we bottled
absolutely
the 18s a few weeks ago, which are going to be great too, incidentally, for those of you. We just bottled those, so they're not anything you want to drink right now, but they're going to turn out great. So Bishop Creek, I did want to show you one thing. I have these bits of soil, and I don't know if you can see these. And I can't, oh shit, I just dropped it on the table. If you can see this soil at all, but if you can also just, it's worth noting the difference. This is Bishop Creek soil, and this is the Momtazi soil. And you'll see the differences in between the two in terms of the Momtazi is a little bit redder and much more chunky. And this Bishop Creek is more sort of a brown, almost even a grayish brown. And it's the marine sedimentary, the ancient marine sedimentary soil there at Bishop Creek. And one of the questions...
It's very visible on the slides when we go to when we'll go to Nisa, how red it is. And here you can see on the center photo how grayish, as you said, this is a photo taken from Bishop Creek, the middle one, that is a bit higher up on the hill, and you see how hilly it is and how beautiful it is actually.
Oh. I went for the live prop here. Those of you, I see some of the names of the people that have joined us have been here to Oregon, been to our house, which is where I'm sitting in the dining room where you tasted. And those of you that haven't been here, you get to see the soil live when you come here. This is one of the benefits of not only do you see us live, but you get to actually put your fingers through the soil. And we can certainly take you out to the vineyards if you do make it out here. Anything else we want to talk about with Bishop Creek, Jean-Nicolas, or should we move on to Momtazi?
I was planning on moving on to Nisa.
That's fine.
If you don't mind.
That's fine.
And there we go, and you can see how red this is. Jory soils, volcanic, very, very different. Therefore, Nisa is not as hilly as it's located on the hill, but it's not as slopey as Bishop Creek, although the elevation is on average higher. It's really very, it's in the heart of the Dundee Hills. It's next to Domaine Douin. Domaine Syrian is a bit further up. And so it's really in the heart of this AVA and within the great sites of Dundee. And this is a vineyard which is, as you can see, is densely planted, and I love that. It's also the case of Bishop Creek. It's not so frequent in Oregon, and this is an interesting, of course, discussion that we have because we believe in tight spacing in Burgundy, although we take it to some extremes. And in Oregon, it's not always the case, but I really think that there is having worked with a number of different vineyards, we really like the ones which are a bit tighter planted. It does make a difference. It makes it easier to control the yield per vine, and therefore get a wine that is going to be grapes that are going to be a bit more concentrated. It's you don't have to make to go to such a great length to control the yields. There is a kind of natural balance, I think, which is easier to reach. But back to Nisa. Nisa, I think it's not too strong to say that I fell in love with Nisa right on, and this is a really such a seductive wine, and this is the mark of the Dundee Hills. It can be really, it's so charming, it's so pretty. Sometimes it's a bit obvious, you know. Sometimes which is things which are a little not so pleasant about this about Dundee Hills. I don't know if you agree with me, Jay. Sometimes the wines are too obviously charming. They can be a bit light, they can be a bit sweet, they can be a little bit too overtly engaging and lacking a little bit of depth.
Isn't this what you say about Chambolle Musigny?
Well, yes, it's. I was trying to avoid the compare it with Burgundy. So thank you, Jay, for bringing that, because I was really going to great lengths not to do that. No, actually, I was. Yes, we. It's not me, but it's Véronique that says that Dundee is the Chambolle Musigny of Oregon, and I think that, you know, I think it's true. It's really true to many extent. But I was talking about, you know, I don't want to quote names, but how a little bit too easy, slightly flabby Dundee can be at some times. And this is certainly not the case of Nisa, because it has a great natural concentration, and I really love the seductiveness of. I'm really, you know, extremely sensitive to this seductiveness, to the smoothness and the elegance, and it's really going through like a kind of silk road into your palate. And I really love that wine. I really love that wine. It does it for me.
So if you think about it, though, Dundee Hills was the first area planted. First of all, it's the oldest for the most part. There are a few older vineyards Highland is down in the south, but Dundee was the most densely planted area for the longest time. And it's also the warmest. It's always the first picks are in the Dundee Hills. And that south side of the Dundee Hills really gets the heat units. And I mean, obviously that's why they planted it there, because I mean, many of the vintages in Oregon, there's been a bit of a struggle to ripen. And so I think what you're really getting at is there are some winemakers, some growers who end up with very ripe fruit in the Dundee Hills as a result of that, because of the heat and so forth. And so consequently you get, I think you get more wines out of Dundee that are riper than maybe any of the other AVAs throughout. But this Nisa wine is, just to echo your point, and I love this vineyard. It has a feminine nature to it, and I know that that's somewhat controversial about people talking about masculine and feminine wines, but this has a softness, an elegance, a grace to it, I find. And sort of year in and year out, the Nisa has those characteristics that it really brings, and is a really key element in the Willamette Valley. I mean, I can't imagine what the Willamette Valley would be without the influence of Nisa in it each year. And I think this particular vintage is drinking well now. I mean, I'm enjoying it, but I do think this wine in particular is going to improve vastly a year from now, 2 years from now, 3 years from now. I had the good fortune to drink a bottle of 2015 Nisa for a different tasting, a different virtual tasting that I did whenever that was, a month ago or 6 weeks ago. And it was really singing, really had evolved quite nicely.
Yes, I was going to mention that, and to say that I've tasted the 14 Nisa also, and I remember it, and it's a great wine. I think that, you know, Bishop Creek in the long run is going to be a more interesting wine than Nisa in 14. In 15, where the vintage is naturally more structured. In 15, you have more natural lucidity, you have more tannins also. It's a vintage which was very, very structured. It's really, there is really an ideal complement between the vintage character and the vineyard character. And I absolutely agree with you with the fact that the Nisa 15 is really great and improving and going on and improving. And it's not to say that Bishop Creek is not good in 15, but it's a bit more. It will take more time, and it's the natural balance is less perhaps perfect as it can be in Nisa.
Yeah, I think the 15 Bishop Creek will be, maybe of all the vintages that we've released now, 14, 15, 16, 17, what if someone said, what bottle is going to be the last bottle to come around into its prime? I would say it would be the 2015 Bishop Creek of every bottle that we've made and released through 2000. That wine is a brooding, big, fella. It's a great wine. But one other thing about the Dundee Hills and the location of Nisa and Duran, this is not far from where Jean-Nicolas and I have put down our roots, so to speak, and purchased the 50 acres where we're going to be having the Nicolas-Jay estate, where we're currently building the winery. And I know many of you, in fact, there's a question about the winery. Many of you have asked where that is exactly. And in terms of Nisa, it's more on the north side, but it's certainly less than a mile from where Nisa is. It may be even less than that. It could be 3/4 of a mile as the crow flies. You can't drive there very directly, but in terms of as the crow flies, it's very close. And so this is where we will be planting vineyards in the next year or two. And it'll be interesting to see the differences between just over on the north side of those very same hills versus on the south side. And we're going to have a little less heat, our grapes, I imagine there, most of the aspects where we will plant, they will ripen a little bit later than Nisa and Duran and those sites. Wouldn't you say?
Yes, it's probably likely, and I hope so.
That was one of the reasons why we bought it.
Yes, but the soil is certainly looking as that soil is certainly as red as that one. So it's really very interesting, and I'm very excited I'm looking forward to making a wine from there in a few years with that kind of soil and that kind of base, because we know that the Dundee Hills is the place which is the better known of Oregon, where probably the better wines are made, and in an area that is probably a bit cooler. This is very exciting. So let's see. Yes, there we have. So Jay, if you see this, you can tell us where our Dudley Ranch will be. We see the city of Dundee, and yes. I cannot show it with my. it's
it's up
going to be
pretty much. If you're looking at the map, if you go straight up from where you see the city of Dundee, the little dot where you see Dundee, if you go kind of straight up the map, you see a little indentation there of the AVA, and we're in that next whatever you want to call it, peninsula in the map that's
okay.
highlighted Dundee is where our new winery is, right in that general area. I mean, that's far from a scientific pinpoint, but you get the gist of what we're talking about right in there. Jean-Nicolas, one of the questions, we've had several questions, but one person is asking, we were talking about wines coming around and getting into their prime and so forth. And the question is it known what element in the wine makes it accessible early, or causes it to shut down or be stubborn and be accessible late?
Well, it's not, but I can. We don't know exactly, but we can. I can certainly provide some info. First of all, we try as winemakers to really bring the wine and bring it to bottling phase and after bottling as open as possible. This is our job, to during élevage prior to bottling, to really present the wine as well as possible. And of course, there may be some other winemakers that say, well, whatever we have in the cask or in the vat, we'll put it into the bottle. Well, this is not exactly this. I mean, you need to, for me, and this is the way I see it, and many and people may differ, but the way I see it, you need to bring the wine to a stage where it's going to be at balance and perfect and really showing at its best. And this is the result of an evolution, a very slow evolution, and you have phases during this evolution, during the time it spends in barrel between harvest and bottling. You have the malolactic, so it's happening very naturally. And so you have the second fermentation. You have to digest in a way the second fermentation. You have to present the wine. You have to put a little bit of oxygen into the wine, but not too much. Have some CO2 go away, but not too much. And all this process is happening in part naturally, and in part you do it. You're responsible for it, and you really want to bring the wine at its optimum stage at bottling. So, and if the bottling is done very gently, without going back to unfined, unfiltered, and this is not really a fad. And the reason we do it is that it's exactly this. I mean, we have a wine which we like in the vat. We want to find the same wine into the bottle. And the way to do that is to really be as gentle and undisturbing as possible. So having a wine which shows well in the bottle at the beginning is the sign that the bottling has been successful. And this is really something that we strive for. And then, the wine lives its own life. And as we can guess, as I said, we can guess the vintage evolution. We cannot really predict it with 100% accuracy because it's a natural product, and we don't exactly know what subtle element there is in the vintage that will take the wine in one direction or the other. In general, I can say, the general rule of thumb is 2 years after bottling, it's fine. 2 years after, when you're going into the third, fourth, fifth year, some things happen where the wine is more or less accessible, more or less open. And in general, after 7, 8, 9 years, it goes back into a phase where it's really becoming more interesting, more balanced, and more coming together. That's the general scheme, and not all, with many exceptions.
Yeah, of course. it's hard to have a general rule, but it's so it's good to answer as I've heard. Let's go ahead and talk about Momtazi.
So there we go. This is a very spectacular vineyard, Momtazi, very dramatic in terms of the hills, the size of the vineyard, the magnitude of it, and the way it's been planted. You see that the owners have retained a number of elements of landscape. There are some spectacular trees there. It's really been cured in a very special way, but very thoughtful way, I think. So it's done biodynamically, which is part of the identity of the vineyard. I really think it is, and it's really a very special way of nurturing the vineyard and keeping it in balance with its environment. Sometimes introducing an element of stress into these vineyards, and sometimes it's in contrast with Bishop Creek and Nisa. The vineyard does seem a little bit more stressed, a bit more less vigorous, a bit more yellow leaves, which is a good thing in, I guess, in vintages which are a bit humid, which is perhaps less beneficial in warm vintages where you have possible problems of drought. But anyway, what I want to say is that the biodynamic element is certainly playing a big role in the character of this vineyard. What it does also, so it's a vineyard which has a lot of evolving aromatic elements. The wine is a wine that displays right from winemaking on an array of various aromas, and we have to pay attention for the wine not to go into the reductive stages. Reductive, it's difficult to explain. Reduction is the opposite of oxidation. Oxidation is relatively easy to describe because it's a plummy, fig, raisiny, and ultimately balsamic vinegar. But reduction is the opposite. It's the lack of air, and it can translate into various aromas. One of them is really when it's really bad, being garlic. Or rotten egg. That's really when it's really bad. But it's so there are an array of aromas which can make you think the wine is going into this direction. It's not a big problem in itself. It's just the way it is. And knowing this, we do want during our winemaking and élevage to really open the wine to help the wine go out of its a little bit rough surroundings, let's say. And so that's one thing. The second thing is this is either by character of its AVA, because McMinnville is a little bit more tannic, a little bit more firm than Dundee. So either it's due to the AVA or to the biodynamy, but this is also a wine that definitely is a little bit more upright, a little bit more severe in its structure, in its body. Whereas Nisa can be very lush and Bishop Creek very big and imposing. This Momtazi would be a bit more, both a bit more elegant and a little bit more severe, perhaps. And this is a very interesting combination because it results in a lot of elegance and a lot of drinkability. This is a wine which really is easy to drink in a way, and really calls for another glass after another glass and after another glass, and before you know it, the bottle is finished.
I think this Momtazi is drinking very nice. I don't know how many of you on the webinar have actually opened all 3 bottles today. If you did, God bless, and certainly you're going to have some wonderful drinking at dinner tonight and tomorrow. But the Momtazi for me is always one of the easiest vineyards to pick out of a blind tasting. When we're doing the blending, we're tasting all the different samples from the barrels, and most of the time, very rarely can you not pick out Momtazi. It has very strong individuality and characteristics, almost sometimes gamey, almost a savory kind of thing going on. Yes. It's always our last vineyard to pick. In fact, 2019 was the first vintage.
It's interesting. It's really if you open that wine. Yes.
I'm sorry?
Yes. So yeah, the connection is not so good, but it's, if you've opened that wine in advance, this is going to be really interesting because this is a wine that changes in the glass dramatically, aromatically. Yeah. So it provides for an extremely interesting tasting experience because of you know, very often this slight reductive side of it allows for really a lot of changes and extremely interesting changes. Sometimes you have very exotic aromas. Sometimes you have you know, a little bit of herbs, and suddenly you have some cherry popping up, and so it's really a whole experience. Actually, it's great. And in terms of body, I really love the restraint, the fact that it's not overly sweet and lush, and it's by no means tiring. Some wines, this is you know, an expression that I use, and Jay always makes kind of a face when I say tiring for a wine, but you know, it's that sensation that one sip or two is enough. It's okay, I'm done with it. But this is not at all the case with Momtazi. It's a wine that, as I said, calls for another glass. And I love that character. I think it's great. It's what we should be looking for into our wines.
Yes, well, I'm always you're never quite sure what that face I'm making is about when you're using the word tiring, but we can talk about that later. But we certainly have a good time when we're tasting the wines, and we're very direct with each other about our thoughts and what we think. But the Momtazi, what I was about to say was that it's always our last vineyard to pick. And I think it's an interesting characteristic. Where it sits in the McMinnville AVA is on this mountain range, what is really the part of the coastal mountain range. And it is near what they call the Van Duzer Gap. And the Van Duzer Gap is a hole that's sort of a depression in the coastal range that lets the cool air come out from the Pacific coast. And as you would imagine, this far north off of Oregon, the ocean is freezing. I mean, the ocean's 50 degrees, 55 degrees, maybe it gets up to 60 in the summer. So it's very cool. And that's where the cool air comes in, and it comes into the Willamette Valley. And frankly, without that Van Duzer Gap, the Willamette Valley would be much, much hotter. And I think it's a real critical element in regards to the overall success of the Willamette Valley as a wine growing region. But in particular, since Momtazi is so close to it and it's up high, our block is at the highest point of the Momtazi vineyard, up on the top of the hill. It really gets a lot of wind and a lot of cool air. And so it's, like I said, other than 2019, where it was the second to the last vineyard that we picked, every other vintage, 14 through 18, it was the last vineyard that we picked, and tends to ripen the slowest. And I wonder, I mean, I don't wonder, I'm sure that has something to do with the characteristic, but it's always an interesting wine. I mean, I don't think I've ever had a Momtazi with anybody and they've said, wow, this is kind of boring. I mean, it's just never boring. It's always got a lot of personality. And the guy that's the owner who planted it and we deal with a lot is this guy, Mo Momtazi. And he is a lovely guy and he's extremely focused and very intense. He's in the big construction business. And so he's got like these huge, like he builds freeways and I don't know what. I mean, all kinds of huge, that kind of construction. And he has this passion that he's put into this vineyard. Jean-Nicolas was referring to the biodynamic. He's on a mission with this thing. And he just does whatever it takes to have this vineyard be successful. And he loves our wine and is very, very supportive of what we're doing and is always extremely attentive when Jean-Nicolas or Tracy or I give him any feedback in terms of the vineyard. But he's a lovely part of the character of the Willamette Valley. And whenever I drink Momtazi, I have a visual of Mo, the guy who's just, what a lovely guy.
Absolutely, absolutely. Very
There's a lot of characters that own these vineyards that we work with. Really interesting characters. We could talk about Nisa, but I guess we won't.
Yes. It's also a very interesting character. But vineyards have, vineyards have their own character. They, of course, are influenced by their owners, but they do live their own lives and as it should be, and it's the job of the viticulturist and then the winemaker to really try to understand what's going on there and what is the character of the vineyard and try to make the best choices according to this character.
I was just going to say, this wine has changed. I mean, I just took another sip of it. I mean, I tasted it, an hour and 20 minutes ago or an hour and 30 minutes ago. And the difference in wine now versus when I first poured it out and tasted it, it's really different and much more perfume, a lot more aromatic than it was when it first came out. And in the finish, I believe is actually longer and actually a little bit more fruity than it was when I first tasted it. Really interesting.
No, it's very interesting because we had that at dinner, and Natalie, of course, always a bit severe, but this is what we are looking for, outside opinion and honest opinion. Was saying, well, I love that wine, but it seems to have taken the oak a little bit too much. There's a little bit too much oak in this wine. And that's interesting because, that was 2 hours ago, and I don't feel, I was kind of in agreement with her with a little bit too much vanilla tones, but for me, they're gone now. I don't really feel them, and it was one of the phases of this wine when it goes through when it's open. And I don't really get it now. I get a wine which is much more fruity than it was when it was open, and more together in terms of the tasting in the mouth, and not so much the sweetness and the special aromas of wood that we first felt. So I don't know what you. If you picked that, Jay, and if you would if you would agree, but this is the example of how it evolves in the glass, that wine.
Yeah, I agree. It's definitely evolving. This is 50. So those of you probably wonder, well, how much oak did you use? It's 50% new oak and 50% neutral. The single vineyards, when we select out the barrels for the Willamette Valley, we're trying to maintain a 30%, roughly 30% new oak ratio. But with the single vineyards, knowing that those are going to be tend to be purchased by folks that have wine cellars and are going to cellar them for longer, we figure that the 50% new oak is going to be an interesting thing to go with. And to answer your question, I did not find it too oaky, even when I first opened it. I mean, I didn't focus on that, but it didn't jump out at me. And certainly now, I don't really have the impression of oak. There's tannin in this wine, but it doesn't really come across like oak to me. Like a
there are tannins, they're not biting. It's there to really sustain and support the wine. But yes, we had a hint of vanilla caramel in the aftertaste when we opened the wines, and it didn't really jump at me either. But I guess Nathalie must have had a different palate and was making this comment. Sure. The palate we need to listen to.
But you need to listen to her for a variety of reasons, not only because of her good palate.
Yes, one of the many reasons. Yes, absolutely.
Yeah. So we've gone over our appointed hour. I hope we're not keeping you all from something. If there's any other questions or comments, shoot them in now. But I think we've covered everything that we wanted to cover. Jean-Nicolas, was there anything you wanted to talk about as it relates to the single vineyards that we have not discussed thus far?
No, I think that we wanted to, I really wanted to discuss about the character of the various vineyards and how I understand and how I like the specificity of each wine. And I think that I've been saying what I wanted to say about each of the wines.
Great. Well, thank all of you for participating. This is a group that we recognized a bunch of names, and we're very gracious to have, or very grateful to have you join us and talk about. These are our little babies, the single vineyards, and it's been a pleasure to share them with you. We are moving ahead with our winery. We're going to hopefully in September have the new tasting room. It'll be by appointment only, but the new tasting room will hopefully be open September. Maybe it'll be the end of September, but something like that. And we are going to make wine in our new winery here in September. It looks like the harvest, I don't know, I think our latest and best guess is it could start as early as maybe the 15th of September, maybe the target date more like the 20th or 24th. So we're very comfortable and confident that we're going to have everything set to go, but it'll be exciting for us to make wine in our new barn. It's an old barn, but the barn that's been renovated to make wine. So we now just have to figure out whether or not Jean-Nicolas is going to be able to fly over here to be part of making that wine. I know that I can't fly to France anymore. I mean, there's no. I'm not going to be accepted in the EU, so luckily I don't have to go there. But we somehow have to get you over here.
Yeah, no, it's. Let's hope it's possible. I'm really becoming very worried about that.
Yeah. Anyways, you guys have a good Saturday evening or afternoon or wherever you happen to be. And again, we appreciate your support. We're very grateful for it.
Thanks a lot. Yes.
And, take care. Thanks so much.
Yeah. Yes. Bye-bye. Thank you.